Aisha, welcome to the show. You are a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator and a police brutality survivor from Eugene, Oregon. But many activists around the world know you as the host of Black Girl from Eugene, a podcast where you interview activists and share stories and experiences of being an isolated, educated Black woman in a historically white town. You mentioned on your podcast that your family was one of the first 12 Black families to settle in Eugene. So you and your family have seen all varieties of white supremacy that the city has to offer, from the overt and the aggressive type to the more passive and discreet kind. So my first question is, given the environment that you grew up in, what inspired you to start talking about these experiences in the first place? And what's been the driving force that motivates you to keep this podcast running for over 3 years?
So what brought me to the podcast was actually the police brutality. The police brutality was the culmination of my understanding of how far my efficacy or my importance as a Black woman was to the city that I had grown up in, had given so much love and energy to. Once I was beat up, arrested, and then spit out, basically, I realized that it was me that was under a delusion of equity, because this was my city and I had been, this Black person here really contributing to the community. My children were high performing athletes, high performing academic kids. We had several of them between my brother. My brother is also an activist and a public figure here, and my sister, herbalist and activist in the city, and we were very, very well known, thinking that we'd be we had some sort of respectability, right? Mm-hmm. Until the police and I have an encounter, and I'm just Black, and I'm not only just Black, but I'm devalued, and I'm very, very humbling for me, not in a way that I had to, the naivete was erased in such a violent way. Mm-hmm. I utilized the podcast as a healing process, because I realized that in the sphere of white supremacist culture, I had pride in myself for being able to speak that language and then flip-flop into my own cultural language. But for some reason, I had lost the perspective that while flip-flopping in this white supremacist culture language and living, that I had lost in that space, that they saw me the other way first, right? They saw me the way that they feel is less valuable. And so like I said, there's so much healing from childhood on, just living in a place like this, that once it all came crashing down, even with my education, it was just the lived experience. I don't know what I was like. Literally, I said to myself, I don't know what I was thinking, right? Like, what the hell was I thinking that I would be, it was actually a moment in the courtroom when I looked at the judge, and I looked at the jury, and I looked at the police officers, and I looked at even my lawyers, and everyone was white, mostly men, right? There was one Asian woman on the jury, and I was like, what am I thinking? Like, why did I think I would be heard here? And it was like, I wish the camera could have like when my face just cracked, and I was like, oh my God, like I subjected myself to torture. You know what I mean? Like I put myself in this position thinking that I'd be heard, and that was ridiculous of me to believe this. And this was 2 years after depositions and all of this stuff, just fighting, newspaper articles, things flying across the country, all of these things. So anyway, the podcast came from a place of healing. I had realized that in that time frame, what I had learned to do is speak from a position of a secondary or third or tertiary, like really back, and just learn to speak as loud as I can. If I couldn't hear it, try to get a little closer, versus meaning that I was looking for the permission to move forward versus saying I deserve to be upfront, right? And I didn't see it that way because I was working with the culture that's here. It's like, it's very much, you don't speak out loud. You don't do this, especially when you've been deemed second or third class. You ask with permission, right? And so because I asked so frequently, I thought I was being heard, but I was still asking. I was asking frequently, but I wasn't being actually heard. And this is from childhood forward. So anyway, the podcast was about saying what I really meant the first time and not going back on it. I don't edit it. I don't even listen to it twice. I don't do anything to it. I say what I said and I put it to the air, and that is it. And so I have to deal with what I say. Like, I meant what I meant. Like, I'm not going to make it easier for you to hear. And 3 years of that now, and I don't even second guess it. Like, it's absolutely transformed the way I show up in the world, period. And it was a healing tool that I created for myself. So I said, I got to be able to say what I mean. And I have to be able to, don't go back. Don't go back and hit delete. Don't go back and make it softer. Don't go back and be like, yes, what I was trying. No, what I meant is what I said. Okay. so that it was an exercise of that. And that's how the podcast came about. Long story short.
As a writer who, has endless drafts that I've started and I've deleted, I know that, like, the stress of sometimes going live is like, oh no, what if I forget what I'm about to say? But I think being able to have that opportunity to just say what you feel, exactly how you feel, and not have to worry about, like, well, I'm not going to waste time going in, downloading, editing out that part that I felt kind of weird about. Like, no, it's done, it's out there, and it's very therapeutic.
Yes.
And so, sorry, go ahead.
I said it's freeing.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And for me, as somebody who tends to be more introverted, it's definitely liberating to be able to express yourself. So speaking of overt versus covert racism, one topic where I think white supremacy is both overt and covert is the Olympics. And the 2020 Olympics have been sort of a minefield of racism, specifically towards Black women athletes like Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, Gwen Berry, Sha'Carri Richardson. And I mean, Simone is somebody who smashed records left and right, and she did it while wearing red, white, and blue, which you'd think that these, true blue Americans would be proud of. And yet, so many of these white American fans have nothing but disrespect for Simone and for many other Black women athletes. So why do you think Black women athletes who are performing at the highest levels of their sport are still being treated this way? And why do you think we hold Black women athletes to just completely different standards?
Well, I mean, that's like a very simple answer. White folks believe that they own Black people, even to this day. Historically and contextually, they're like, back to my story, there's never been actual permission given to be great. Right? And it's been that story ever since. It's always been, you will do what we want you to do. And even when it's been post-slavery, actual enslavement, the rules have never technically been taken off the books, right? The ownership has been reimagined into other displays, but the freedom and autonomy of Blackness is still up for debate. And so when someone what's interesting about these Olympics to me is not the show of racism. What's interesting to me is that there's nothing different about the Olympics except for the women saying, you're not going to do this to me. I'm actually going to choose myself first. And then the racism, then it all swells up into something else. But the Olympics has done what the Olympics do. What's different is that the women are saying, I've earned my space and I've earned my autonomy and my respect. So I'm going to go ahead and take my sovereignty and do what I feel is best for me. And that is what the problem that we're facing is. So when it comes down to it, it's the ownership of Black lives and Black bodies and Black spiritual minds that once you know that old thing, once they get a taste of freedom, you can't stop. Once they get that knowledge that they can do more, then you really can't turn it around. And this is what where we're at. We're actually vocalizing that, yeah, no, right? And in a very public, in a very influential way. And someone like Simone Biles, where no one on this planet can tell us what it means to be her. Meaning that no one has been able to compete at her level, therefore none of us know what it takes to be there. She is outstanding in the very meaning of the word. She outstands everyone else, which means she gets to tell us. That is something white rich men who own that sport cannot handle. And that is what I'm noticing. So I mean, I think it's really important to not follow the narrative that we're being shown, and look at the reality of it. There's nothing different about the Olympics, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But there's something very different about Black women this year, right? In the last 3 years, the voices of all traditionally or historically, populations that have been completely ignored is starting to get louder and louder and louder. And because the fact is more apparent that without us, the voice, the courage, and really the industry that we now have, it's very apparent without us, there's just not a whole lot left for what the money is flowing to. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Think about it, the Olympics without everyone you just named. Mm-hmm. Those are the greats in every aspect that those are the greats. So, and then you go to the secondaries and there's still people of color. There's still the great. So it's one of those things where it's an awakening. And the person, the people, the community, the society in which we're all pointing fingers at, is screaming loud, screaming unfair, screaming something's out of order. But when we sit back and really look at it and just go, shh, nothing's out of order here, right? We're just not going to continue to play by your rules. We want equity, and we want recognition and respect for the money you're making off of our backs, right? And that's what's happening. And so I think it's amazing. I think it goes right along with everything else in the world. The structures that we know are falling apart, and the new structures that and I don't even want to say new, it's like the voices that have been muffled by that old structure are just getting louder and louder. And so I'm here for it.
So on that subject of white supremacy, you also said something on your show that I really loved, which is white supremacy didn't end. Black and Indigenous people of color are surviving white supremacy. Yeah. So can you explain to our audience this idea of surviving white supremacy, and how does that relate to your experiences of surviving in Eugene?
I was just going to say, it's like the story of my life. Honestly, white supremacy culture, white supremacy itself, I mean, think about it. Like everything that I do, everything we do as Black women, Black people, in order to get ahead, has been to assimilate to this particular type of culture with no assistance at all. Matter of fact, with barriers, with absolute conscious design to keep us in third or fourth or fifth place, not second place, but third, fourth, or fifth place. It goes all the way back to just when we talk about critical race theory. It goes the laws that were created to absolutely ensure that Black people were always going to be the fallback. We're going to be the scapegoat. We're going to be the reasoning. We're going to be how crime continued. You know what I mean? It was going to be laid on this particular type of community. So when it comes to surviving that, what happens in a Black household is paramount to the survival of Black people. So that's why the crisis of the healthcare crisis, the environmental crisis, all of these things that are external are putting more pressure on the Black household to be able to raise these children very biculturally. In the household, we're pro-Black. We're loving you. We're loving your skin. We're loving the hair. We're loving our lips. We're loving our rhythm. We're loving our intelligence. And then we have to take that in such a fierce, loving mode and put it into the world that is consistently and constantly and in a very violent way hating. And this is from our children. Remember, like, I don't know that if you've heard of my podcast, like, average child who lives in a high proximity of whiteness is called the N-word by the time they're 7 years old, right? So this is before you're spelling your name confidently. You're having to defend yourself as a person that's valuable and has the right to be anywhere. So talking about surviving that is trying to keep that person, square, aligned, empowered, right? And feeling that their capability and capacity is not measured or to the same what's the word I'm looking for, level that the white society, the white supremacist culture society is insisting that it is, which is low. The expectation is very low, if there's an expectation at all. And this is when it's this high in high proximity. Living in white supremacist culture with the lack of that community is when you can come out loving yourself, you can come out strong and feeling courageous enough to speak out loud about your right to survive or to exist. That's close to a miracle. You know what I mean? Without it being really crushing you as a person. There's people I know who walk around as adults who did not have a robust Black community or a community of color, period, to uplift them and tell them that, giving you that oxygen when you can't breathe, when people are pushing you back, or, shaking your shoulder, like, you can do it. That's literally what's happening when you have to go to school every day and combat your teacher being racist, your friends being racist, your coach being racist, and then you have to come home, right? And then you got to get fed again, like, you're powerful, you can do it, and then you go out. That's what surviving this is. And that's every single day, right? And that's not an exaggeration. I mean, it just isn't. Every day there is, I can come home and write down what happened to me that was racist, right? And so after a while, you start to get this way of dealing with it. And that's harm. And you start to be able to say, well, this level of harm I can hold, this level of harm I can't hold. You're damaged. You see what I'm saying? And so there's people here in high proximity without the community that struggle with identity as adults, right? Mm-hmm. And that identity, when they're trying to still decide what Black really is for them, because it can't be solidly and unapologetically Black because that means trouble, right? But it can't be white because they know that doesn't feel safe. So they have this, like, maybe they were raised by white folks. Maybe they just never had any other Black friends and they're the only Black people. That's a reality in the Pacific Northwest. Now, throughout the country, I've lived in several different places, several different countries. And the racism in white supremacist culture, even when you have the proximity of your own culture around, is another kind of survival. But no matter what, we out here just trying to live. We're trying to make it. And I'm not even talking about like what it takes to teach your child how to survive a police interaction. We're just talking about going to school and trying to be chosen for the debate team without being tokenized. You know what I mean? So that kind of survival, I think it's important to bring it down from the movies, of all the reality of what white folks really want to see as us, like, fighting the police on the ground and bleeding and doing it and go, oh, we survived. No, coming from school and believing you're still beautiful and smart after everything that we are in just the indoctrination of inferiority, coming from the school system, coming from the grocer, coming from all the white spaces that you have to encounter, and still go back the next day believing that you are valuable. That is surviving white supremacy. And that literally is my childhood.
Wow. I mean, so another topic that you had discussed on Black Girl from Eugene podcast is the fact that Black folks have to be ultra self-aware of their tone and presence when talking within white spaces because of the history of white folks misrepresenting Black communication or expression as aggressive or intimidating. And this oftentimes leads to Black folks being silenced because they have to censor their language or they have to code switch so white people don't mischaracterize them. In your life, how have white folks from Eugene try to misrepresent you? What labels have you tried to force on you? And how did you learn how to shed those labels and find your own voice?
I don't know that I have shed those labels, like, because they're gonna do, white folks gonna do what white folks do. You know what I mean? Let's be real, all right? I don't know that I've shed any labels. I know that I am, and this is kind of unfair because I'm intuitive, right? And I know white folks better than white folks will ever know me. So, right? And so I really, I am very good at reading the room and switching when necessary, right? Meaning switching the code. And I also, like I said, can read their language better sometimes than they can. You know what I mean? So what that means, because out of survival, right? We know the code, we can see it, we can smell it. We're like, smells like bullshit, right? And they're like, what's going on? You know, like I already know. So that's the thing. And so to be honest, you know, they might label me lots of things. I know I've been labeled conceited, like in a very, you know, because even when I was struggling with confidence when I was younger, I still was more confident than the average white girl, right? And I was still labeled as like, oh, she thinks she's better than everyone else. And or as an adult, I've definitely been labeled, I think, as you know, I'm not really sure, because I just know that the more successful I get, the more isolated I am. Less people really, meaning like not professionals, because professionals I work with all the time, but when it comes to like social groups or when it comes to, you know, when it comes to colleagues, I have way less of that the more successful I get. And so I'm sure there's lots of things being said about me. And I don't know, you know, but I know as when I was younger, the whole average thing, you know, the loud, the think she's better than everything else, you know, the basic, you know, kind of chauvinistic kind of stuff, like, you know, I'm, what is it, bossy, you know, these type of things, which I think, you know, I could probably like, probably, maybe, you know, I don't know, but I don't really, I've always just found that most people don't know me. And so I don't really hear it like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I recently lost my mother, and it is a devastating loss. And I remember talking to my mom and being like, so-and-so said this about me. Like, what do you think about that? And she's like, well, I don't know why we're talking about this person. Like, what does that person have to do with anything that you're doing? Actually, like, are you trying to, is your day, you know, revolving around making sure that they feel good? You know? And I'm like, no. And she's like, yeah, well, let's move on. You know, like, let's move on. And so, and I'm a very sensitive person. So when things are said about me, I don't like for people to not feel comfortable around me or feel like I'm doing something to them, you know, that kind of thing. I don't like that feeling. But as I've gotten older, I've had to realize boundaries. I've had to realize everyone has their own journey, and the way people perceive me is their own, really a reflection of how they're perceiving themselves. And that's okay. So, I mean, I don't have a good answer for that one, because I try my best not to hear it. And, you know, the people who are most important to me, I listen very well. And they are, they're always telling me, hey, you know, there's not a lot of you. There's not a lot of people who do what you do. And it's not because what you're doing is bad. It's because what you're doing, a lot of people can't do. So don't listen. These are average people talking to someone who's not average. That's what my family tells me. That's how they pump me up, right? So I don't worry about it. I'd be like, okay, when someone wants to pump me up, and someone wants to work with me so I can pump them up, then we're talking a different conversation. But if these are just people who just want to slow me down, like I can't stop, right? It might hurt my feel like I feel like Lizzo. It might hurt my feelings, and then I let out another outlet. So that's how I feel about that.
I like the channeling of that negative energy to reinforcing yourself.
Right. Right. I mean, I am in the middle of I'm in the beginning stages of writing a book. And so I feel like when my book is published, the publisher came to me and was like, I want you to write a book. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know how to do that, but sure, I'll just start writing. And so I'm like writing this book, and I hope they're going to edit it and make it sound like a book. I don't really know. But I'm writing it, and I feel like once my book is published, I'm going to be like, yeah, I wrote a book. So
Don't talk to me. Don't talk to me.
I don't know. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, it's like I'm trying to find people who are doing what I'm doing so I can have that aspiration and have, that kind of, I don't know, just
like a better support system.
Yeah, support system, and have other people who are failing like I'm failing. Like, like, can we talk about it so we can like lift it up? I love it. I'm talking about.
Now, during your privilege and fragility episode, you had talked about the talk, which is a reference to the initial conversation that Black parents have with their children about racism, anti-Blackness, and how to live and navigate in a world with white supremacy. As a Filipino American, I never received this talk because our family just didn't talk about race in that very self-aware way. I knew racism was real, but I had to learn about white supremacy and decolonization through school and through my own research and experiences as an adult. And one of the things that I've learned are all the prerequisites that you need to understand to learn sort of the full extent of white supremacy, because to be able to understand how white supremacy impacts pop culture or work or dating, you need to have a foundation of history and politics, which means true understanding of white supremacy can sometimes be hard to achieve for the sort of average person. But as an educator from Eugene, how do you approach the conversation of white supremacy with people who are like level 1 activists, people who are, these are people who know that racism is real, but they still have no grasp on white supremacy or systemic racism, sort of the larger scheme of things. How do you break down white supremacy for someone who's just starting to understand it?
Yeah, that's a great question because, so I live in Oregon, right? And the average person is right about there. You know what I mean? The average person doesn't have a damn clue, right? Just doesn't understand it. And so basically the unique part of my educating, the unique part of how I approach diversity and race education is that I try to bring it out of the academia and down into real life, right? So now academia is good for research, I believe, and academia is really good for, like I said, picking up the facts and putting them together and writing a book about it. Like it's a research thing, but it doesn't actually translate very well to when I walk through the door. Why are you looking like that? Why do you feel like that when you see me? Right. And why do I know how I'm supposed to, survive this interaction and while you're so nervous during this interaction to prove to me that you're not racist while being like the most racist in the world. Right. So that part is what people don't understand. The most well-read people, and I mean like they've read all of the books, they've done all of the things, and then they talk to you and you're like, in your tone, I can hear that you don't believe right? Like you actually don't believe my value. So what people don't do, so when I explain this kind of things, first of all, there's tenets of white supremacist culture. Like there's anything about culture, there's pillars in that culture that stand up everywhere you go. And so there's, if I could just think of the researcher's name, there's like several researchers, they put together this document, and it's the tenets of white supremacist culture. It's like 23 years old, and it stands up to this day. People use it all the time. So generally what I do is I start there, and basically it's like these ways that white culture show up that if you deviate from these norms, then you are then identifying yourself as other, right? And so when we talk about these norms, which is a few of them: perfectionism, urgency, the right to comfort, like all of these things are white supremacist culture. So when you go into other cultures that are not based in the Eurocentric belief system of superiority in that way, they don't operate out of these tenets. They just don't do it. And it's just not, it's actually anti all of these tenets, right? It's very group oriented. So basically what I do is I start with what we consider normal. Let's talk about what we consider normal. And it's all of these tenets. And we say, okay, so if someone, let's say from Cuba, doesn't believe that urgency is important, right? That we can take our time. You can be there 10, 15 minutes. Party started at 2, I'll be there at 3. The party is still going. It's not anything to you that I showed up at 3. Matter of fact, if they showed up at 2, it'd be kind of rude, right? Like they showed up exactly at 2 o'clock, you are rude. Like, are you here to help? Like, are you here to pick up a broom and start sweeping? We're not ready. Like, what the hell are you doing? So like that sense of, urgency. So if you deviate from that, what is the feeling you have? Now I'm asking the person of privilege, what in that space are you valuing this person who doesn't value what you consider to be normal, right? And when you're doing that, you're taking that normality and pushing it, literally pushing it on to someone who just doesn't align to that way of life. So if you're doing that, how far are we from inclusion? Like, truly. And so when we start talking about it on that level, it becomes much more personal. And of course, one of the questions that I always ask all the people that I train, it doesn't matter who they are, CEOs, directors, yoga teachers, how do you feel about Black people, their wellness? Like, everyone wants to know, wants to be a hero. But the truth of it is that Black people have been okay. Like, we've been surviving when it comes to, no education was given us. We learned how to read, right? No housing was given us. We built houses. No banking systems. We built a banking system. You see what I'm saying? Like, we've been able to do this. So it's not that Black people don't have the capacity or the capability. But white folks love to be a center of a hero story, right? So, and the barriers and giving access, when the truth of it is that you can't give access if you don't have ownership. The truth of it is that you want to own and be center of, not only of the system and how it's systemic, but you want to have ownership over how I wear my hair. You want to have ownership over how Simone Biles, is scored when you would score her. Ain't nobody on the damn bench for her, right? So this is and instead of saying, Simone, what can we bring you to the table and talk about how we should score this in case somebody comes? Since you're the only MF that got here, maybe we should be asking you questions. No. We got to control, the white folks got to control and got to be center and continue that superiority. And that's all in the tenets. So that discussion is what we have. And that's why my direction with race equity is a little different than the average, facilitation that you'll get, because I'm asking white folks to think about how much they think about Black people in their wellness. Like, what do you know about the successes? And don't talk to me about Martin Luther King. Like, I that's not what I'm talking about, right? Like, I want to know, when you close your eyes and you think about Black men, if it's not sexual, what is it? Right? If you think about Black women, if it's not sexual or angry, what is it? And so, and lots of people, 96% of people don't have a real answer. I never thought about Black people like that. So what are you thinking about Black people when you're an activist or a social justice warrior? They like to warrior, So what are you doing, right? Because if you don't even understand what equilibrium looks like for the Black community on their terms or our terms, what are you fighting for? So that's the part that I need to have a real discussion about, because don't give me the rhetoric that you hear in the newspaper. I want to talk about your personal investment, right? That's the most important part. I want to change culture, not verbiage. And so that's the difference. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's perfect, because I that's the first time I've really sort of heard that kind of approach, because I've always, valued people who can teach different complex social and political issues and take it away. I mean, have a sense of the theory and sort of the research behind it, just so you know that you're speaking truth. But to be able to translate it in a way that's easy to understand for anybody, that is like the art of it. And I love the way that you've sort of put the focal point on what people see as normal, because that's just one of the things that sort of people have guarded underneath. And it's easy to ask them questions about, like, oh, well, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? Well, like, it's easy to ask them like hot topics and them to give you the right political answer, but to question the normal, the things that they've sort of deemed normal is what really sort of gets to it. So I absolutely love that framing of education. I think that's brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I love it when they try to give me a political answer. I'm going, oh, that's good. So let's talk about and they're like, what? Talk about me. I'm like, oh yeah. How do you feel about it? It's like, and I did this with, professors that teach race, environmental studies based in race, and they don't have a good answer. That's the kind of thing that we have to start looking at, like, you know what I mean? So anyway, it is great. I mean, it's great because I love when I walk away from people who've been doing this work for 20 years and are super invested, and they go, I never thought about it that way. Yes, success, right? If one person says, I never thought about it that way, I am done for the day. Like, you know what I mean? That's exactly my whole goal. Yeah.
I love it. All I know is whenever people hear this, they're probably going to feel the exact same way.
Success. I love it.
So for my last question, our second to last question of the day, I want to end on a slightly more optimistic note and actually talk about the future. So you've been in Eugene for most of your life, so you've seen its problems, and I'm sure you've also witnessed the occasional beauty and splendor of the area. But what do you think is the best possible future for a historically racist and predominantly white town like Eugene? Because we all know that Eugene isn't the only town in America like that. So what is your hope for other places similar to Eugene, Oregon? How can they do better?
Wow, that is like an amazing question. Because, okay, so the reason why that question is so amazing to me is because you put that in there, like, the splendor. There's splendor here, right? I always say I love Eugene if it just wasn't for the people. And then I'm like, well, I mean, there's some cool people here too, right? There's definitely people here. The kindness is real. Like, there's people here who are great, right? And then the majority of people here are really lost. And then on top of it, it's more of this idea of the way that systemically that the state, I'm going to say the state works. It doesn't, I mean, the people matter, absolutely. The culture is imperative to address. Systemically, if it doesn't change, that is what, if it doesn't get written off the books, if it doesn't fundamentally be taken down, deconstructed, and reconstructed, the history and tradition of racism will continue. And so what the part for the future of these little cities is actually being educated and having the courage to really look at what they consider traditional, what they consider normal, what they consider to be the way things we've always done, like what levels of that is actually doing harm, right? I always say, people are like, well, the most comments I get is that there's just not a lot of Black people here, so why do we have to change everything? And I have to turn that back around and just be like, at what level do we quantify? Are you willing to quantify, safety, and a livelihood, and at what level, what number do we have to get to be considered, human to you? And when you put it that way, they're like, well, of course you're human. Well, okay, what we're telling you is that the morbidity rate of Black people having babies is, like particularly, like, let's just say in Oregon, the death rate of Black people dying trying to have babies is at crisis level, yet no perinatal, like maybe one, possibly two, in my city are addressing anti-Blackness in the hospitals because there's not enough Black people here. But that one Black person who comes in, the rate of the possibility of them dying is over 70%. Yet that's not the reason to do better when it comes to anti-Blackness, because there's only one person and they die. That's not a big deal because there was only one of them. Is that how you really want to do your practices? Is that really how you want to lead your fight for inclusion? Like, it has to be that one person that comes in, it feels comfortable, and the one person that leaves felt welcomed. If that's not your goal, then I don't know. Then you have to really actually admit to what your goal is, and it's to keep the status quo for what it is, which is predominantly white. You can't not name it. This is 2021. It's time to call it like it is. So when I talk to when I'm thinking across the country, and this is really my goal in the next 5 years, is to take my talks and my lecturing national to these little places and talk to the nonprofits and work with the businesses there to really talk about the benefit of inclusion, the exponential, benefit. So we basically have to be able to comfortably allow someone to show up authentically. And that means we have to talk to you. Like, we got to talk to the white folks of that city and really be working on them being able to understand that other people's authenticity is not a threat to their own. And that, I know it sounds crazy, and I know it sounds like hand holding, but our education system has not only screwed Black and brown people of the truth of their story, but it has screwed white people of the lies of their privilege. And that is something we have to talk about. We got to let them understand this is not, you've been lied to too. We have to deconstruct the culture of white supremacy, not that there's anything necessarily horrific about the fact that you've never learned it. We didn't, like you said, you came in, we had to learn it too, right? We all learned white supremacy. Some of us benefit and some of us go, that's not working out for me, this American dream thing. It's happening. So then it becomes a different reality for us, right? So, I mean, I'm of the kind to be more kind, meaning that I'm going to give the benefit of miseducation, mm-hmm. And I'm going to go with miseducation before I'm going to go with malice. And so if it's miseducation versus malice, I'm going to go, with the miseducation, and I'm here to teach. And, now if malice shows up, I got something for that too.
Now, Aisha, it has been a pleasure having you on the show. I think I've learned so much in our brief conversation, and I know that a lot of people who listen to this will feel that as well. Before we say goodbye to our audience, what are you working on, and where can they find and support you?
So I got so much stuff going on. Oh my God. Okay. So what I'm doing, I am working on my Black Girl from Eugene, the LLC itself. I'm working on taking my lectures national. I'm working on a book called Black Girl from Eugene. I have a nonprofit that is, I have a nonprofit that basically, well, I have a couple. One is working with middle school children, and we are empowering and providing information and providing capacity and providing encouragement to just be great, and tying it to historical knowledge. And the one thing I'm really happy and proud about right now, I'm proud about that too, but I also have a program that I run called Nurturing Black, which is a program for white parents who are raising Black children. And I meet with the parents and we talk to them about race and how they feel about racism and how to raise a Black child that doesn't have community to feel empowered and to feel seen. So that is the part that I love, and the program is picking up. We're getting groups of parents, cohorts of parents coming through. I work with them for about 4 weeks, and then we have an ongoing support group so that they can really support their Black child in a way that's in harm reduction, and talk about race and talk about their relationship, their parents' relationship to racism. So it's really, really impactful, and I love it. So that's what that's what I'm doing. Yeah, that's what I do on a Sunday in my podcast. And my podcast is doing what it does. But when it comes to Black Girl from Eugene, I'm wanting to spread this approach to race and inclusion, nationwide, to all the little cities like Eugene, for all the Black girls and Black boys who are surviving in these little towns. Like, I want to be of assistance. So that's what I'm doing.
Awesome. Well, Aisha, it was fantastic. We'll definitely have to invite you back onto the show. Everybody, definitely go ahead and subscribe to Aisha's podcast. We'll include all the links below. Thank you again, Aisha. It was great. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.